Hi, my name's Amelia, and this is the story of how Jesus changed my life. So, I grew up in a Christian family, raised by Christian parents, and I was taught about Jesus my entire life. So, I became a Christian when I was about 7 years old, and the way that happened was I was reading my kids' adventure Bible, or it was a comic story Bible. And at the very end, there was this comic about a kid about my age who prayed with his parents the prayer of salvation. I had read that prayer multiple times, and then one day when I was reading it, it just kind of clicked. And I was like, I want to pray that too. I want to be a Christian too. That night after I read that comic and decided to become a Christian, I told my mom that I had become a Christian and she wanted to talk to me about it. So that night I prayed with my parents, and that was the night I became a Christian. Then after that, I kind of was just living as a 7-year-old does. I was a kid. So, I was still learning about Jesus, and I was still doing what I think was my best to follow him, but I was also so young that I didn't really understand fully, the weight of all my sin and how I was messing up every day. So middle school was the time that I started to really grow in my faith, and I started going to student ministry at my church, and the sermons were very impactful to me. And I remember many, many weeks of just sitting in church, listening to the sermon, and just feeling God's presence and feeling him move in my life. And so it continued kind of like that, with some higher moments, some lower moments, but it was pretty steady until about 3 years ago in February. I experienced my first battle, like spiritual battle and spiritual warfare for the first time. It kind of came out of nowhere one night when I was praying, which was a really weird moment for it to happen, but I remember praying, and then all of a sudden I felt like God had just disappeared and like I couldn't feel him anymore. And that was the most terrifying time of my life. I wasn't gonna cry. I just remember feeling so alone and abandoned out of nowhere, and nothing had prepared me for that. And all of a sudden, I started dealing with a lot of doubts and a lot of thoughts about doubting God and having anger towards him that I didn't know where that was coming from. And I think something that was really impactful, not in the greatest way, was that I hadn't really heard any Christians that I knew, or like anyone that I knew that I looked up to spiritually, talk about having doubts. So in my mind, that was something that a strong Christian didn't struggle with. So it was really hard for me to go through that thinking that, this kind of silly thought, but that I was the first Christian to deal with doubts and that I was a bad Christian for that. This continued for a couple weeks of every day, just having, every second of every day, I was having these doubts and these thoughts in my head. And it was so overwhelming. I genuinely don't remember how I did anything else. Like, I was having to do school and go places and talk to people in between all of this stuff. And I don't remember how I did that. But I do remember it just felt like I was doing everything but physically fighting something. And I knew that was Satan. I knew that was him attacking me. And then I finally tried to talk about it, but I didn't want to go into full detail because I was so ashamed of myself. So I talked to my sister one night, and I just told her a little bit about how I'd been having some fear and some doubts. Didn't really go into much detail, and I was trying not to cry when I was telling her about it. I was like, she can't see me cry. But I remember her encouraging me a little bit and kind of making me feel like I wasn't alone in that, even as a Christian. And I think after that, things started to get a little bit better, and I started to figure out how to get past this and to grow through this. And there was this one moment that happened a few days into this that I woke up and I still felt like I was fighting something mentally and emotionally, and I was fighting all these thoughts. And so I was praying to God, which one thing that never stopped this whole time was I was praying to God, even when I felt like he hated me and wanted nothing to do with me. I was just so desperate because I knew if I didn't have access to him, if I didn't pray to him, I had nothing in my life, because my entire life had been built off of communication with God. So I remember this one day that I woke up and it still felt awful. So I was praying to God and I was just asking him, like, please take this away from me. Like, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to have to go through this. This is horrible. And I remember at some point in the afternoon, he did take that away. Like, all of a sudden, my mind felt at peace. I felt at peace. And my mind was quiet for the first time in multiple days. And I felt relief, of course, because I had asked God to take it away, and he did. And then for a couple hours, I was just thinking, like, why would he have given it to me? Like, why would he have tested me in this way? And I realized that even though I didn't understand it, he wouldn't have made it happen unless it would have grown me and impacted my faith. So after just a few hours of having a mentally clear mind, I prayed again that if he was really going to use it and if he was really going to grow me through it, then he could bring it back and he could let it happen again. And almost instantly, those thoughts came back, the feelings came back, the hopelessness came back. But I also had a little bit of an anchor knowing that he had answered me, which meant, one, he heard me and he still was listening to my prayers, and two, that he really did have a plan for it all. So I decided to just blindly trust that, even though it didn't feel like trust. It felt like I was just holding on for dear life. I just kind of clung to that one bit of knowing that he had promised to me that he was going to use it for good. A while. This whole thing lasted probably 2 months, and it was the hardest time of my life. It was the most I've ever cried in my life. Like, every night, almost every night, I was kept awake by fear and just feeling desperate. And I just remember sitting up really, really late at night knowing I needed to sleep and not being able to, and just crying out in desperation to God. The majority of the time, I still felt alone, but there were still several times where I knew because I felt like I had to just believe this, that he was there and that he was watching me. Because I knew if I didn't try to believe that, then I would just completely give in to the hopelessness. So eventually, I started doing a bunch of YouVersion plans and reading a bunch of like devotionals and books about fear and how to kind of use scripture to battle that and to fight that. And the entire time that this was happening, I don't think I ever told anyone the full extent of what I was going through, because I was still ashamed of myself, and I still hadn't heard people say that doubting as a Christian was normal. So I was still trying to hide that from everybody and act like I was okay and that everything was normal and nothing was happening. So little by little, there was no time again where all of a sudden it just went away in the snap of a finger. The way that it kind of got better was just very gradual and very slow, and a lot of just me trusting that God was still working and trusting that he was going to bring me out of it. Until eventually he did. And I remember the first few days where I felt at peace, and it felt so good because I hadn't felt that in probably 2 months. As I was getting out of that and as it was getting better and I was kind of going back into my normal life, I remembered a prayer that I had prayed probably not quite a year, but several months before any of this ever happened. And I remember praying to God, asking him to break me and build me up again, because there had been a sermon preached on that kind of thing one Wednesday night, and I decided to go home, and the pastor said, do not pray this if you don't mean it. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to make sure I mean it if I pray it, or else I'm not going to pray it. And so I think that night I sat down, I was like, I really mean this, God. Like, if it's going to bring me closer to you, I want you to break me. I want you to break up any of the dark places that are still inside me. And then I didn't realize till after this whole thing had happened, I thought back to that prayer and I said, that whole time period was him testing me, and that was his way of breaking me to build me up again. And there were just so many moments where I realized I don't think I ever saw the full picture. I still don't understand the full reason. I just remember there were so many moments, and I honestly didn't realize they were happening until I looked back on them, where I was experiencing God and he was showing up. And I was just so blinded by my fear and my expectation that he was mad at me, that it was hard for me to see that he was actually there. I've definitely gone through some times of doubting and having that kind of experience since then, but it's never been as bad. And thankfully, something that has come out of that, besides an even bigger trust in God and his provision, is like practical ways that I can use scripture and use the community that God's put me in to battle that kind of fear. I feel like I have techniques at my disposal and I guess a battle plan at my disposal to fight that kind of thing. And so there are occasionally times where I'll start to worry that I'll go through that again and that I won't be able to handle it this time, and that it'll be scary and it'll be really, really awful, and I don't want to go through that again. But then I remember how he brought me through that and how he was faithful through all of that and how he's prepared me to deal with that kind of thing. And I think the main thing that I want people to realize when I tell them my story is that doubting as a Christian is normal. You can be a really, really strong Christian and still go through doubts and still be afraid. Sometimes you can be afraid that you aren't actually saved. You can be afraid of losing your salvation. And that doesn't make you a bad Christian, because to be honest, we're all bad Christians. None of us are good at being a Christian. I think the other thing I want people to take away from this is that once you've accepted God into your life, there's never a moment that he leaves you alone. And there's never a moment that he's not watching out for you and he doesn't love you. And if you feel like God is mad at you or doesn't want to hear from you, that is the enemy, that is Satan lying to you and trying to break up your communication with God. And once he has that, my sister told me this back all those years ago, and it really encouraged me. She said, never stop praying even when you feel like that. Feel that fear and that hopelessness, because if you stop praying, that is a big victory for Satan. And that is one thing that he'll rejoice over, is that he's made you stop talking to God. He's broken that connection. So just never stop talking to God, even if it feels like he doesn't hear you, or he doesn't care, or he doesn't want to hear from you, because he does, and he always wants to hear from you. And he will always bring you through the things that he promises to bring you through. So I guess my question is to you, have you ever felt like God was mad at you and that he didn't want to hear from you? And if so, did you believe that, and did that make you stop praying to him? If you have believed that, and you have stopped praying to him and communicating with him, then go right now after this ends and go talk to him. Even if it's questions, even if it's just crying, even if it's screaming, just go communicate with God.